Thank you for joining us. I'm Ben Lima at the University of Texas at Dallas, and I'm here today with Dr. Nils Roemer, who's the Stan and Barbara Rabin Professor in Holocaust Studies, the Director of the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies, and the Interim Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities. Our conversation today is part of this series from the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History at UT Dallas, entitled Falling and Rising: Public Monuments and Cultural Heritage in a Time of Protest. Thanks very much for participating in this conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. Good to see you, Ben.
Likewise. So today we will be discussing a set of monuments in the northern German city of Hamburg, which reflects changing attitudes towards war and history from the 1930s up to the present day. So to start with, I wondered if you could just kind of introduce us to this set of monuments and some of their relationship to one another.
So maybe just to begin with, we're looking at these particular monuments from Hamburg, so simply on the grounds that Hamburg is my hometown. So that's where I was born. And I thought, well, this is maybe not a bad way to begin. But before we even begin, we might want to consider the issue of language. Yeah. And so you introduced this as a series of talks about monuments. And the most striking thing right away that every native German speaker will recognize is that the word monument kind of does translate into the German language, but then really doesn't. And in lots of ways, the equivalent in German language that is more often used is a very different one. And I think that already brings us a little bit into the nature of most monuments that are at the forefront at public debates right now in Germany. So historically, it would be fair to say that a monument would be a statue, building, structure erected to commemorate a famous, notable person or an event. Yeah. Well, the ones that we're looking at are not exactly of that nature. Right. So in many ways, Germany would have had and Hamburg would have had their fair share of monuments that were created to commemorate and to celebrate the memory of something in the past. But these days, most often, many of the monuments are more conflict-ridden, and we don't necessarily refer to them as monuments, but either as a Denkmal, which is a place to reflect. The kind of root word in it is denken, which is thinking. Right. Or even worse, Gedenkstätte, which is more reserved for places of violence and mass atrocities, a place for reflection, but also has the word denken in it, or indeed Mahnmal, which is a warning sign. So in other words, before we even look at any of the monuments, we right away know that we're dealing with a very different set of monuments. And the very first one that I find interesting is one that initially started out presumably as a monument, and then I guess became more of a warning sign. And that's hopefully the kind of common theme of something that I want to emphasize in my talk today, that monuments are not written in stone. They don't have fixed meanings. They are subject to change and subject to interpretation in many ways. And hopefully it'll come out in lots of ways, in today's kind of conversation, how much that is the case with the examples that I picked. So let's go to the first one. Okay. Initially created in 1936. It's a kind of rectangular, massive structure placed in a fairly visible place in the center of Hamburg, next to not the central train station, but to the second most important train station. So, not relegated, to the periphery, so very, very visible. And it's dedicated to a particular military unit called the 76ers, not the ones from Philadelphia. We're dealing with a different type of 76ers here, but to a unit that fought in the Prussian-French War of 1870s, and then again in the First World War. Okay. And in 1936, the Nazis celebrate their memory by this massive structure, which has this, these marching soldiers, 88, life-size soldiers marching around, totally uniform looks. You just see them from the side, and then an inscription that reads, first in German, Deutschland muss leben und wenn wir sterben müssen, Deutschland must live even if we have to die. Mm-hmm. So it's this very celebration of heroism and sacrifice.
Yeah.
So what happens to this? It was not a Nazi monument at first. It didn't celebrate the Nazis. It was not dedicated to Himmler or Göring or Hitler, but dedicated to the past. And it's for that reason that when the British occupy Hamburg, that it does not get destroyed. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which then, however, created an interesting question: what to do with a monument like that under now radically changed circumstances where Germans, in particular in Hamburg and elsewhere, didn't want to celebrate any longer the war against France that led to the creation of the first nation state in 1871. They didn't want to celebrate any longer the First World War, nor do they want to celebrate or recall the Nazis' infatuation with either one of those.
Yeah.
So you're looking at a massive site. And so I think at that point, not just in Hamburg, and Hamburg was not the only example of inheriting a good number of sites that displayed a certain type of history that was not in line with contemporary sensibilities of what to do with it. And that kind of brings me a little bit to the 1980s. And this is the time, where I lived in Hamburg and where I vividly, remembered the debates about this in terms of what were the choices. So what do you do with a monument like that? Yeah. So a lot of youngsters took the most obvious choice. They vandalized it, they spray painted it, and did anything else possibly that you could do with this, because it was a real monstrosity.
Yeah, yeah.
Second one, some advanced the idea that it should be just leveled to the ground. Mm-hmm. So leveling to the ground would have, eradicated this, horrific, visibly horrific piece in the smacking center of the city.
Yeah.
It was also argued would have erased some of the history of the city and its military tradition and background. Hamburg, from the 1870s onward, in many ways had become the kind of harbor of the German emerging empire. It was, this is from where the colonial expansions went. Yeah. And so it had its own very peculiar history. And so therefore then, what was ultimately decided was, instead of eradicating it, the idea was conceived to place a counter monument alongside with it. And I think that's, probably the one that interests you now a little bit more, right? Not the old one, but the new one.
Sure.
So what do you think about the new one?
So this new one from the 1980s, I guess you'll talk about it a little bit, but I guess one of the things that is very striking, you already discussed how the 1936 monument is extremely massive, and we'll see a picture of that. But the 1980s monument is obviously it's much lighter, and I guess the style would be considered somewhat more expressionistic, instead of this kind of solemn, solid heaviness. It's more kind of open and flowing. So even if you don't know the history, you see the difference in style right away.
Very much. So it's also much frailer in sorts, because it conceives not like this massive commitment to sacrifice and quote unquote heroism, but it was initially conceived to comprise 4 elements, but ultimately only 2 were right. completed. But the very first one, I think that's the one, not the statues that you're referencing, but rather this kind of a thin layered metal that goes upright, depicts the firestorm. Yeah. And so the firestorm, in lots of ways, has its own interesting history. This is part of the Allied attacks on German cities under the codename Sodom and Gomorrah, with the clear goal to eradicate, ideally, the better part of the German cities. And Hamburg gets particularly hit hard. Yeah. And one of the kind of most notable moments is one of the attacks, occurs during the summer in '43, when the grounds are really dry. And so after the bombs explode, there's a firestorm that really plows through the city. So it's this really high point of well, from the German perspective of German victimhood.
Yeah, yeah.
Very complicated.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of an odd choice. So you're trying to counter a document that celebrates Nazi ideology and heroism of soldiers. And you're placing the suffering, well, of whom? The suffering of German civilians, but not of the civilians that suffered under Germans alongside with it. So it is a counter document, but a monument, but it kind of sits alongside in its own pocket. And then alongside with it are these individual statues that also seem to speak to a tragic moment, and indeed they do. And the ones that they elevate is a very unfortunate moment when, toward the end of the Third Reich, most of the camps are being emptied of their prisoners. That is, you know, most often associated with the so-called death marches from the east, from Auschwitz and places like that, but it happens on a smaller scale also in the West. And when the prisoners are taken from the Hamburg camp, Neuengamme, they are placed onto a ship, and British Air Force mistakes that ship and bombards it. Mm-hmm. And thereby, a good number of these prisoners, Jewish prisoners, actually die on this tail end. So it's two really curious choices if you think about it. And they are both part of a far wider discussion that in many ways remains you know, an ongoing issue of debate up to this day. In what ways can you actually commemorate the different parts of what otherwise we call the Second World War? There, you know, in lots of ways, obviously, Germany is the aggressor. Germany attacks Poland. Germany is the instigator. Germany is also the country that initiates the genocide. So in lots of ways, it's quite obvious where guilt is, right? Mm-hmm. But within that larger picture, that doesn't override, you know, the fact that on other levels, in a smaller manner, Germans nonetheless would have experienced for themselves, quite individually, maybe the firestorms, Sodom and Gomorrah, in a certain way, as something that caused them grief, harm, and loss, right?
Yeah.
And so the question has always been, how do you relate the one to the other? And so historically, it has often been argued that after 45, Hannah Arendt says this, you know, very famously when she visits Germany in 46, she says, well, these Germans, they're just not catching on to reality. They're sending each other postcards depicting parts of their cities that don't exist any longer, and they just bemoan their own losses, not realizing their own responsibility for the harm that they caused. So in lots of ways, it was often felt that remembering Germany's own victim role came at the expense of embracing, respectively, the responsibility for the harm that they had brought elsewhere. So in that respect, you know, this gets a really complicated story between these two monuments. And now we're not done yet. There's the third, right?
Right.
The third one is you know, actually speaks now already from a very different sensibility. Mm-hmm. And you have to remember these three monuments, or whatever we want to call them now, Denkmäler, or places that provoke thinking, they're within like a minute walk from each other. So they're very in close proximity to each other, and they're meant to kind of speak to each other in contradictory ways. And they're not part of an overall narrative, but they are kind of edging into each other. Yeah. And so the third of the monuments is a really interesting one. What did you make out of that one?
Well, so this, which is only a few years old, 2015. I noticed that, well, first of all, we were talking about the kind of form and the shape of the memorials, and this one by Volker Lang is exceptionally transparent, and in fact, significantly, a lot of it is formed just by text, which was something else I thought we could talk about, the role of text in each of these three works. But I noticed that this one specifically commemorates those who rejected the Nazi program by actually deserting or walking away or refusing to serve. And I thought, is this a kind of a new definition or a redefinition of the idea of the hero, that you are being a hero not by fighting, but by refusing to fight. So it's rebuilding the kind of concept of hero. I don't know if that's right.
I think that's very well put. And you know, if you just think about the spatial arrangement, this one is actually the one that is closest to the 76er document. So you have the 76er with the soldiers marching, willing to give their lives so that Germany can live. Yeah. And then alongside with it, you have these, you know, very open installation with the names of 227 deserters that died because they refused to serve in the German army. And so that I find, you know, it gets you to another, this is now 2015, so this is a very different moment. So now we're celebrating, we're not distancing ourselves any longer just solely from what the military tradition might have been that culminated in the Third Reich. We're not just simply trying to complicate the narrative, but now we're at a point where we are entirely revisiting actually who are our ancestors. Yeah. And so now our ancestors are becoming the ones who deserted, and they're becoming our heroes. And so I think that's a really, really interesting moment. And you know, think about how radical this is. I mean, think about an idea, a monument dedicated to those that desert army, and place it into any other national context.
Yeah.
Not a popular choice. And remember that this is in the smack in middle of a very large urban center, but by far not the only one. This is a new movement within Germany, you know, that kind of started overall in the 1980s, but really gained more currency over the years. And by 2010, there had been already over 20 different monuments dedicated to deserters throughout Germany. So the Hamburg one is not the only one, in other words, that does it. But if you take this now together, then I think we have an interesting moment here where respectively the meaning of each one of these monuments, of these three, is kind of complicated by the presence of the others.
Yeah.
And where there's not a narrative one that kind of comes, you can kind of come away from it, and where, however, also respectively, quote unquote, the authenticity of each historical moment is preserved, and not cleansed into a brighter, newer future that rewrites the past.
Right. I know that you mentioned briefly the kind of attitudes that especially young people had towards the 1936 monument, but I was curious also about the role, or how the public responded to these newer monuments, whether from your own recollection or otherwise, if these were sort of seen positively in general, or if there was any controversy as the new ones were added.
Well, I think this is, again, you know, these are not meant to be monuments in the ways in which, you know, we traditionally think about monuments. These are meant to be objects or subjects of debate, or things that engender debates. And, you know, any one of these monuments has seen their fair share of spray paint and whatever else you can think of. But I think they remain there, and they are preserved by the Senate, and they're cleansed, and they are constant subject to debate. And there's more than this. And so I think that's also really telling that in many ways, even a city like Hamburg, we're not talking Berlin. Berlin would be even more extreme. But even Hamburg has, you know, by now endless amounts of smaller monuments to individuals, to moments that kind of talk to a more complicated sense of the past. And I think each one of them tests the grounds again in different ways of what the public is willing, you know, to go along with in terms of, you know, complicating the past even further. But what I find interesting is in the ways in which, at least here, it has occurred that the three memories don't eradicate each other. So there's no blocking out. They all coexist in their own ways. And so Hamburg has had that ongoing history that instead of using the present to kind of whitewash the past of sorts, that it tries to incorporate it into a kind of more complicated narrative, without, however, presenting the past in ways in which it never existed.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me of this other very significant site which you mentioned, which is the Church of St. Nicholas, which was originally, well, not originally, but there was a 19th century Gothic structure, which I understand was one of the tallest churches in the world, which then during this Operation Gomorrah, this firebombing, which you mentioned, the bulk of the church, the nave, was basically destroyed or mostly ruined. The tower somewhat survived. And then, so after the war, after 1945, there was this question of what to do with this church. And I wonder if you could talk about that.
So also really kind of curious side of sorts. You already mentioned the better part. One of the, you have to understand always location. It's placed in a way that from its tower, you have a fantastic view of the Hamburg harbor. So it's a very prestigious place and has a very particular, attraction for tourists. Yeah. And so that complicates this a little bit, that it's not just a church somewhere, stashed away at the suburbs or something, but it's prime location. So again, here we have overtly a site that commemorates German victimhood and therefore being really, really problematic, because it stands in maybe for, again, Germany's inability to confront the legacies and responsibilities of the Third Reich, but which tellingly, almost from the beginning, became a site that never just commemorated the air raids and attacks on Hamburg, but also equally what Germans had done to Warsaw, to Coventry, and in other words, the part of Germany's contribution to the destruction of European cities elsewhere. So in lots of ways, therefore, the site itself tried to preserve the church in its destroyed stage, like it did elsewhere with other similar churches in Berlin, for example. So it was never an idea to rebuild the church, but rather to kind of keep it in that way. But today, the church has numerous other smaller monuments placed alongside with it that reference other aspects of the Third Reich, all the way to a monument that was erected out of remnants and of material from one of the nearby camps, a famous installation by Kokoschka, and a museum that is almost strange to the point that when you go through it, the first part of that museum introduces you to 19th century Gothic church architecture. And you think, well, this is kind of innocent and nice. And then the second part introduces you to air raids and the attacks on German cities. And the third part introduces you into the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. And there is no way of bringing those three together, but they exist all in their own ways. And so I think, therefore, this church, just like the other site, and this is like my way of thinking about these, the church and also the three monuments, or the two in particular that existed already in the 1980s, have always been the grounds where any kind of larger demonstrations that were, motivated by fears of war and by desires for peace, meaning the peace movement, that's usually where they took place. And so this church early on became the site, where even the mayor and others conducted, these rallying grounds to call upon Europeans to preserve peace, to overcome the Cold War. And that became a really, really powerful message in the 1980s, when these sites became more and more relevant, because in the 1980s, we were still in the middle of the Cold War. And so there was a whole generation of young Germans, well, you're a little younger, but think about all the good music that Europeans listened to in the 1980s. This is like the age of angst, right? Of Cure and of Smith and of Clash and whatever else. And so this is a lot of counterculture, and a lot of individuals who also, for various reasons, make use of the German, not constitution, because Germany didn't have a constitution at that point, but of the Grundgesetz, the foundational law, that gives them the opportunity to opt out of compulsory military service. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so that's where all these things kind of come together, because for many, therefore, these sites carry a huge significance. And And the significance is not any longer, the church itself is also a good example where you kind of walk through it and you're not walking away with a particular lesson. In particular, the Oskar Kokoschka installation, Ecce Homo, is not really any longer using the biblical text in a theological manner. But if you look at it, you see the tormentor and tormented have almost acquired similar facial features. So there are lots of ways deformed equally by the conflicts of the violence of sorts. And so I think, that church in and of itself is a good example again where these otherwise often conflicting memories of the Holocaust, of Germans, of the Nazis, destruction of European cities with German quote unquote own victimhood that seem to be impossible to reconcile. They all kind of coexist there. And the overarching theme that you take away from it is that it is more this kind of rallying rounds for a stance that celebrates the deserters, like the one does, or celebrates the idea of absence of violence.
Yeah. So it really seems like, as you're saying, that it's not just this, to repeat what you said, it's not just this kind of binary choice, either destroy the old monument or preserve it, but by adding, I keep using the word monument, by adding the new works by the newer artists, it adds a broader perspective that complicates and keeps it from the simplistic kind of narrative.
Very much, and it's also one where, I think we have a good example with those few monuments, and I think I emphasized this early on. They're not, words written in stone. There are lots of ways, regardless of their physical features, they're constantly rewritten and and reinvented in terms of the meanings that they have, and their meaning doesn't preside in the architectural designs or the kind of visual language that they employ solely, but also very much in the ways in which contemporaries make use of them and kind of reinvent them into their own kind of ideas. And I think that's something quite obvious maybe when you look at these, but in lots of ways something that you find in a good number of German cities, and Berlin obviously also very much, where the choice never was simply to erase everything. I mean, think about Berlin. How much erasing could you have done of the Third Reich, of the GDR, of the communist regime? And so I think Berlin too, has rather gone this kind of midway of preserving some sites and some inscriptions and eradicating and transforming again others. And that's in a way, I think, the kind of gist also that you get from these Hamburg monuments, where, however, each one of these monuments was created with very wide-ranging public debates. So I think they are part of the public sphere, and their meaning gets decided and negotiated in the public sphere, and therefore theoretically participates in it. So there's no real hierarchy of interpreters. It's not that the makers have the authority or have the full power of establishing what it is. And I feel sometimes, to kind of loop back to some of the other participants in this cycle of conversations, that regardless of, the parts of history that Germany or Hamburg is trying to revise here, that sometimes our debates here kind of have locked us so easily into an either or. And I think in many ways, in my mind, these monuments, I've walked, by them, I don't know how many times, and I think they always have created actually a far more engaging and kind of unresolved and past that, invites people to participate than these kind of alternative binaries, either we keep it or we erase it versions.
I just wanted to also ask you, I know that, many people say, I think rightly, that the United States can certainly learn a great deal from the ways that Germany has addressed the question of remembrance and and coming to terms with the past and so forth. But more specifically, I mean, you mentioned that well, Hamburg in particular, being from that city, and then you've also, obviously you've studied and now are on the faculty here in the United States, as well as having also been in England and Southampton. And I just wanted to ask, based on your experience significantly in each of these different countries, I wonder whether your time living outside Germany and now living in the U.S. has given you any different sort of perspective on the approach that Hamburg takes, or that Berlin takes, or more specifically, what the United States could really maybe learn from?
Well, I think it's really difficult to kind of this is the German way, this is the American way, and this there's this kind of quote from the former British Museum director Neil MacGregor, who says that the Germans use their history to think about the future, whereas the British tend to use their history to comfort themselves. And I think that difference, in lots of ways, we started out as encapsulated in the word monument, right? Monument to commemorate and kind of celebrate something worthy to remember, versus the German words, the kind of Denkmal or whatever else. But I think it might, be, Germany didn't have that as a choice any longer, right? After 45, this became a little bit impossible. So in lots of ways, there was not a great deal of choice maybe, but there was only one way to go. But I think more importantly, if you look, and if you want to see what the United States has been capable of doing, look at Washington, look at the Mall. And then you see all of a sudden that the mall itself is not unlike what I'm describing here. It is on the one side dotted by the big installations, but at the same time, there are numerous smaller monuments throughout. But there's also a noticeable difference than, let's say, between the Vietnam Memorial on the one side, that I think really speaks more to this kind of sense of suffering and of loss, versus the Second World War Memorial, which is all about heroism and glory and so on and so forth. And then in between, you have the Holocaust Museum, you have the museums to the Native Americans, you have the museum now to the African Americans, and each one of them, even in the architecture, suggests a very different engagement with the past. So I wouldn't want to say that this is the German way and this is the American way. I think the American way, so to speak, is also far more complicated. I think where we kind of had initially a sense that there was a bit more of a simple-minded or one-sided way of thinking about the past was when we looked at the Confederate statues, that, when 2017 this debate erupted, it seemed as if they just all along had always existed, and without much public debate or outcry, nor with any attempt to revisit them, nor with any kind of sense of maybe reinscribing them with a more complicated and more inclusive history of sorts. So I think, therefore, I wouldn't want to subscribe entirely to this idea that there's this one notion of the past. And Germany also has its fair share of really complicated monuments. I selected the ones that I like and that I think give a certain kind of complexity to the remembrance of the past. But there's obviously also quite a bit other elements. Hamburg has a gigantic monument still that is celebrating Bismarck, the creator of the German Reich. As of late, a lot of the scholarship on the Holocaust had then started to veer into the field of Germany's colonies and the atrocities that Germany had committed in its colonies. And Hamburg, as the hub of German colonialism, has its fair share to the colonial past that has existed, on the sidelines, and has never been quite, as much scrutinized as this past has been.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for this conversation about these monuments. This is part of the O'Donnell Institute series, Falling and Rising: Public Monuments and Cultural Heritage in a Time of Protest. And those who are watching can find out more about this series on the website at utdallas.edu /art history.
Thank you very much.